morning, everybody. Does everybody remember their first job or their best boss? My first job in London, I had an awesome boss. She was all carrot, just a little bit of stick. And the biggest carrot of all landed about 2 years in with an all expenses paid business class back and forwards to a conference in the States with Sally, my wife. I was 26 at the beginning of my career, so this was a massive perk for me. We flew to Phoenix, picked up at the airport, driven into the desert, and there, a glimmer of green, an oasis, tall palm trees, a golf course in a desert, and at the center of it, a hotel, an edifice of marble, ballrooms, chandeliers, and a 2,000 square foot swimming pool. To sustain this extraordinary feat of engineering and imagination, there were pipes from hundreds of miles away, from California, from deep beneath the desert surface. It was extraordinary. And I had a wonderful time. But now at COP26, and in the midst of the climate crisis, I reflect and look back and view that in a different way. I see it very much as a crystallization, as a representation of and a significant contribution to the issue that we face today. And that was because that hotel was designed for one single purpose: to host hundreds of conferences every year, attracting tens of thousands of visitors. And every year globally, 300 million visitors go to in-person trade conferences, exhibitions, and conferences. Every single one of those visitors creates 2 kilograms of waste, of which over 85% goes direct to landfill. All of the usual suspects are there, the name badges, the plastic packaging, and so on. And we've tried to respond with good intentions. We've attempted adaptation. So now programs aren't printed. There are different coloured buckets into which we put our different types of recyclable or non-recyclable waste. And if we're staying at a hotel, we only ask for fresh towels every other day. But it's not working. The scale of the problem is too significant because it's not the 2 kilograms of waste for every 300 million people that go. It is, in reality, the 2 tons of CO2 emissions, the 2 tons of CO2 emissions for every person that goes to an in-person conference. The figure needs to be unpacked. If we're going to address that, we need to understand where that comes from. Well, 75% of those emissions comes from the travel to and from those destinations. That is 450 million tons of CO2 emissions every single year. They're enormous numbers, but we knew the size and scale of the problem, even if we didn't know the specific number. We've known for years that air travel had a significant and calamitous impact and contribution to the climate crisis. And yet, in the last 2 years, we have seen that where there is a need and where there is an urgency, we can do business from home. We can work with colleagues effectively remotely. We do not need to travel for business. And we now know that a virtual event creates 98% less CO2 emissions than an in-person conference. At the height of the pandemic last year, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance Summit needed urgently additional funds replenishment for vaccine research and for the equitable distribution of those vaccines. There could have been no more urgent mission. They gathered 40 heads of state from around the world. They raised $5 billion in 4.5 hours. Not a single person travelled, not a single person got on an aeroplane. Working virtually worked. Now, we know the problem and we know the solution. So why is it that there is this increasing return to doing travel for business? Well, we have been socially incarcerated for 2 years and we're probably a bit bored of Zoom. We are now capturing this information. Stanford and Harvard have done very interesting research, and this is now measured clearly in the Zoom exhaustion and fatigue scale. This calculates the impact of working virtually intensively on our sociability, on our motivation, on our emotional well-being, and our physical well-being as well. We know that responsible organisations are now investing significantly in their employees and in their staff and in their colleagues. It may be that we, as social animals, are simply not wired to work virtually intensively for such a long period of time. But virtual does not have to be 100% virtual. What do I mean by this? Well, the opposite of flying to another continent, to another country, or even within the same country, the opposite of that does not have to be being anchored at your kitchen table or perched on the edge of your bed. Hybrid is the best of both. Meet physically, in person, locally, sustainably, but connect globally, virtually. Hybrid. Let me tell you first of all what hybrid is not. Hybrid is not a group of people sitting in a room, having a conversation, being filmed and being broadcast outwards. That's telly. Hybrid are communities of people meeting together locally, sustainably, and connecting virtually to other communities who are meeting locally and sustainably anywhere in the world. And they may be joined by dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people virtually online. The World Bank, the British government, and the Kenyan government met earlier this year. They acknowledged and recognised that there were huge and profound challenges for education for children, particularly in the global south. This was exacerbated by the pandemic. There was, again, an urgency for political action. So world leaders met in person, where it was possible, where it was sustainable, but many more world leaders and politicians and diplomats joined virtually. There was a physical space for some to meet in person, but there were also online thematic stages. Journalists met virtually in virtual rooms, and journalists met in physical rooms, both combined together to challenge and to question and to hold political leaders to account for the pledges that they were making. But most powerfully for me was that children who otherwise would have been completely excluded, no way of taking part in the conversation, were able to join virtually, were able to communicate and participate and speak yes to those powerful men and women who were making the decisions on behalf of their lives. I look back at that conference that I took part of 25 years ago. And it is with the realization that in-person conferences have been dominated for too long by the same people. They come from the same places and they have the same lived experiences. Virtual technology provides us with an opportunity to open the world up for climate justice. For those communities who, for too long, have not had a voice at the table, have been unseen and have been unheard. And hybrid takes local, sustainable physical contact and meetings and applies virtual technology to communicate globally. The only constraints that we face are the limits to what we choose to do. It was a wonderful conference 25 years ago, but I had no choice on how I got there. I had to fly. For the last 2 years, we've had no choice. We couldn't fly. We now have that choice. Let's not fly. Thank you very much.